All right, well, with that, let's get started. Our first speaker tonight. Our first speaker tonight is Ken Hoff, who is going to talk to us about auth routes with React Router, which I'm super excited to hear about. Let's give Ken a hand.
All right, cool. Oops. Let's start there. All right, thank you everybody for showing up tonight. My name is Ken. Tonight I'm going to be talking about front-end auth routes with React Router. This is the first time I've given this talk, so it's still a little rough around the edges. I've only put it together in like the past couple days here. It's pretty, on the fly kind of thing. But I am recording it just to like try and get a better idea of how I speak in front of audiences. It's good practice for me, and it goes well on the portfolio and blog and all that kind of stuff. So, launching right in here, hi, I'm Ken. I'm a full-stack product engineer. I like to build dumb, fun web things on the internet. I've been doing it professionally for about 4 years now. On the side, I also live stream on Twitch while I work on my cars. So if you guys need something to talk to me about afterwards, you can always come up and ask me about that kind of stuff because I can talk endlessly about that stuff. Let's see, I'm currently developer advocate at Stream. Stream is a company that allows you to build scalable and personalized activity feeds. This is sort of my standard plug that I give here. Basically, if you are building an application that looks a little bit like Twitter or Instagram or any of that kind of stuff, anything that has a user feed or a timeline feed or a news feed or something like that, Stream can help you scale that from 100 users to 100,000 users, no problem. So if you are working on an application like that, come talk to me afterwards. I got a whole bunch of my coworkers in the room too, so they'll be able to answer questions if you have those too. And if you want to revisit this talk later, don't worry about getting everything down right now. I have all the slides and the source code and the live demo up at these links somewhere. I will post the link to these slides in the meetup description just as soon as I'm done with the talk here. Neat. I'm currently working on something called Wins. Wins is an RSS reader and a podcast player app. It is technically a showcase application. It's something that we're building at Stream to show off all the cool personalized activity feeds and follow suggestions and content recommendations that we've got going over at Stream. One of the things that I want to point out about this, I'm not going to go into detail about this thing, but basically this application is an Electron app. It has lots and lots of different views, which means we have, your dashboard view, we got a podcast view, we got individual podcasts, we got lists of episodes, we got profiles, we got create account views, we got login views, all sorts of different views going on, and we do actually have a bunch of auth pages centered around this. Create account, forgot password, reset password, sign in, all that kind of good stuff. So this is definitely applicable to what I'm actually talking about tonight with React Router. And of course, tonight we are learning about React Router. That's the little logo right there, and how we're going to build front-end authenticated routes with it. What you should know for this talk, or what I would like you to know for this talk, but realistically you're going to be able to get some value out of this anyway, you're going to need to know a little bit about React. Basically how props get passed down into nested components. A little something called composition. It sounds like a big scary word, but basically it is just wrapping components inside of other components. Not that big of a deal. It's also good to know the difference between authentication and authorization. I get pretty pedantic about this stuff because I used to work at the identity team back at Microsoft. Authentication is me basically saying, are you who you say you are? Is Ken Hoff who he says he is, given that he has this username and this password? That's authentication, excuse me. Authorization is Ken Hoff allowed to access this resource or modify this resource? Does he have permission to do that? That kind of stuff. So tonight we're going to be talking about authentication, not so much about authorization. This is a quick little overview about how this is actually going to work. To build a front-end auth routes, first I'm going to talk a little bit about React Router theory, practice, all that kind of stuff, just in case you've never used React Router before. And then I'm going to talk about the case for front-end authenticated routes. Realistically, you can get away with a lot of auth on the back end, just depending on what responses you send back and forth with your API. We need to dive a little bit into the route component specifically, what kind of props are available for us on those, and then actually using those props to create auth routes and unauth routes. Finally, I want to make sure that I can reuse all those auth routes and unauth routes if my application has 100 different routes. Each of them are authed or unauthed to different degrees. All right, so what React Router does is it basically renders different React components based on the window location. Based on the URL up there, what components do I actually put onto the page? The nice thing about this is that we can actually change the content on the page with no hard refreshes. Granted, we have been doing this since, the Web 2.0 era, with original JavaScript and jQuery and handling state all that way, but React Router does offer a super clean and easy way to do that, especially with React components. I'll give you guys a quick demo here. This is the demo linked on the slides as well. So you can see this is a ripping simple web app here. We have a home page, which I click on this. It says this is a home page. Click on the pricing page. This is the pricing page. Click on the About page. You'll notice up at the top here, because it's hosted on GitHub Pages, the actual structure here is a little bit wonky with the base URL. But you see, as I click between home and pricing and about, all of those URLs are updated. There's no actual hard page refreshes here. If I go to the About page and refresh the page, then of course it's not going to work because GitHub Pages doesn't have rewrite rules enabled. But hypothetically, with your application, if you were serving the same sort of app.js, whenever the application loaded, it would automatically route to the correct component. What we're going to be working on tonight is this My Settings and Sign In page. I'm calling it My Settings because this is something that's going to be very personal to the user, something that they should only be able to access when they are authenticated. For sign in, this is something that you should only be able to access when you're unauthenticated. If I click on sign in, I see this is my sign in page. I click sign in and it takes me to the setting page, and I click sign out and it takes me back to home. I'm still unauthed right now. If I click on the My Settings page, when I'm unauthed, it actually redirects me back to the sign in page, no matter how many times I click it there. Similar thing if I actually sign in and then now that I'm currently signed in or authenticated, if I try to go to the sign-in page again for some reason, it won't actually let me do that. It'll always redirect me back to my settings. So that's kind of what we're going to be going for tonight. All right, and then, of course, docs for React Router are off at this handy site right here. This has really good docs. I'm really, really happy with all the docs that React Router has, especially with the V4 version. Super, super highly recommend it. All right, simple example with React Router here. We got a couple different components. We got a couple different props here. I'm going to go through each one of those, just kind of explaining what these are. Router right here is going to be our wrapper component, essentially the thing at the top level, which is going to manage both the history and the location and any other bits and pieces that React Router needs to function. It's going to use a little known React feature called context, which is not something that you usually see outside of routing. History is a prop that just allows you to use browser history or hash history or memory history. We're not going into that in this talk. Down here, I have a couple of different link components. Link components are available within the React Router, and essentially what the link components do is they are going to wrap that anchor tag on the page. It's still going to render an anchor tag on the page, but it is going to attach event handlers to each one of those anchor tags and prevent whatever click events happen when you actually click on that anchor tag. We'll see how that works. We do this mostly because when somebody clicks on the anchor tag, we don't want a hard page refresh when they're navigating to a new page. We just want React Router to handle that navigation in state. The last thing that we have here is a couple of different routes. These routes are how we define what components are actually rendered based on the URL that we have in the navigation bar. If the URL is /home or base URL /home, then go ahead and render the home component. If the route is /pricing, go ahead and render the pricing component. Same thing goes for about. One thing that I should note is that it is totally possible to have a bunch of nested routes going here. I don't have that set up here, but you can definitely imagine the pricing page also navigating a couple nested routes or the about page, all that kind of stuff. If I'm going to bench test this, create React app is probably the easiest. I'm just going to go ahead and copy and paste all this stuff over. I have a create React app instance set up right now. This is my router. It's currently rendered to the page. Just going to go ahead and paste this stuff in here. I'm going to beautify it a little bit. Got all my links, got all my routes. Going to save that. Come back on over to my local host right here, hit refresh real quick, and I can see I've got my home page, my pricing page, and my about page. Neat. All right, I talked a little bit about all of the different React Router components. We got the router, which is the top level sort of container component for a React Router, the thing that manages all the state for us. We got our route, which defines what components we render based on what path that we render. We have the link tag, which is a good idea to use with the React. What happened there? please work. Oh, come on. Did I? Oh, I might have. Good call, Dave. There we go. Perfect. Thanks, Dave. Let me make sure. All right, that's still working. Perfect. All right, so we get the link tag, which wraps the anchor tag and basically just prevents a hard page navigation back and forth. There's one other component that we're going to be using today, and that's the redirect component. And the redirect component is exactly what it sounds like. Just redirects the URL of the page to a new URL without necessarily causing a hard page refresh. Because if I were to just do window.location equals /new page, then it's going to give me a hard page refresh, and that's not going to be a great experience for the users. Now, one of the things that that we think about, whoa, that's kind of an interesting setup there. Let's see, let me do, it might be, yeah. Tell you what, let's do it on the local host here. Yeah, here we go. It must be a Unicode thing. That's what's going on. All right, cool. So front-end authenticated routes, why would we necessarily even want this? This isn't that big of a deal. If somebody is coming to our web app and they want to sign in, they have to click on, and they click, the My Account page. It's not that big of a deal for us to just do a hard refresh and send them back to the sign-in page. They click on the sign-in page, they put in their credentials, and then we do another hard redirect to the My Account page or wherever else they need to go. It's really not that big of a deal. The tricky thing comes in is, well, the big thing that we get with front-end authentication routes is that we don't get any of those hard redirects when we are authenticating back and forth between the input of the credentials or redirecting based on deep linking or stuff like that. It's nice to have in the web apps. It's not necessary. People are used to refreshes and redirects in the browser. But if you are building something like an Electron app or a native app or a progressive app or a mobile app or something like that, it is actually super, super critical for you guys to have that. Because if somebody pops open a desktop app or if somebody pops open a phone app and they punch in the authentication thing and then they see a white screen and then come back, and now they're at their My Account. That's not really a great UX. So even if it is just that little thing going on there, that does improve your UX significantly. The other sort of like bonus feature with this thing is that if you guys are using code splitting, if you're using asynchronous loading of the different chunks emitted by Webpack or something like that, then you can actually load up a whole bunch of your web app before the user actually authenticates in, which means that as soon as they log in, you can use a nice little clever loader and then boom, like they're ready to go in the app. You don't even have to worry about loading times there. All right, here's how we want to set up our redirects. This is the little example that we're going to build here. We already have our home, pricing, and about pages. All of the users that come to our page, if they navigate to home or pricing or about, I want them to stay put. I don't want to redirect them anywhere, regardless of whether or not they are authenticated or not. However, if an unauthed user goes to the My Settings page, I want to redirect them back to the sign-in page. In a similar vein, if an authenticated user somehow made their way back to the sign-in page, I want to just go ahead and redirect them to the My Settings page so that way they don't sign in again for some reason. So that's kind of the goal that we want to go for here. The approach here is that we are going to use basically auth routes and unauthed routes. With our auth routes, we're going to say that we should only render a component if the user is authenticated. If the user isn't authenticated, just go ahead and redirect them back to the sign-in page. All of that makes sense. For the unauthed route, basically the same thing, but in reverse. Only render the component if the user is not authenticated. This would be like a sign-in page or a create account page or a forgot password page. Otherwise, redirect them back to the My Account page or something like that. If we don't care for this specific route if the user is authenticated or not, then just go ahead and use the plain route. That's not a big deal. Maybe route has something built in for this. This is something that this didn't seem like a unique problem to have, so I poked around a little bit, and apparently some people have figured this out. Turns out that you can set this up using the actual route tag. And for that, we have to kind of dive a little bit deeper into the actual route component. There's a couple of different props that surface on the route component. We've seen a bunch of them so far. We've seen the path. That is the actual URL that you want to match in the browser in order to render the component. I should note that inside of the path prop, you can actually use sort of like express URL parameters. So if you have /users/:user ID, you can do that no problem. And then when you actually render those components, you can extract that information out of the URL super easily. just like you would do with Express. You have the component prop, which we've already looked at. We basically just have, here's our pricing component right here, and if the path matches pricing, then go ahead and render the pricing component. And then the last component, the one that we really care about specifically for this talk, is this render function. You actually have to provide a function to this, and then it is only called if the path actually matches the URL, which means that this isn't going to get called when rendering at all if the path doesn't actually match. So I should also mention that there's lots and lots of other route props, things like exact and strict, or like specific or strict or whatever it is. Basically just things that help you sort of match weirdly formed paths and that kind of stuff. So these aren't the only props available on the route, but these are the ones that we are going to care about right here. This little snippet down right here, route, path about, and then using the render prop, passing in an arrow function right here, and then returning the about component. This is functionally equivalent to us just passing in the component prop and then passing, just passing the about component to the component prop inside of the route. This is all getting, a lot of words here. But yeah, these two are essentially functionally equivalent here. So now we get into the authentication, or the authentication portion of this here. What we're going to do is we're going to use that that render prop. It's only called when the path actually matches. Inside of that function right there, we can check to see if the user is authenticated or not. I should note that this has to be synchronous. If you try to run asynchronous code inside of a render function, you're probably going to have a bad time. If the user is authenticated, then go ahead and serve whatever component you need to serve. If the user is not authenticated, then remember we are going to return our redirect component. That is part of React Router, so that way we get a nice little redirect without necessarily causing that hard page refresh. That's the theory behind this. Now let's actually put it into work here. So we see route, that looks good. Path, my settings, okay, that also looks good. Render. And then this is where it gets a little bit weirder. For the most part, we basically just have an if-else here. If some function, user is authenticated, then return the settings component. If the user is not authenticated, then return the redirect component with a to prop. Couple things to note here. User is authenticated. This method is totally authentication method agnostic. You can use cookies if you're using sessions. You can use JOTs in local storage if that's what you're using. You can use authentication state stored in some type of higher order component. You can also use Redux state if you are storing authentication state inside of Redux. It gets a little bit more complicated with wrapping the components, or wrapping the routes with router. But that's for another time. The other kind of funky thing here is this render props method. What is props in this case? Props, it's a props argument, and it is passed using the spread operator to the settings component as props right here. This props component is actually a bunch of props that the actual route component injects into each one of these other components. Things like location and history and match. It's like the way that you would use it's the props that you would use to extract like a user ID out of a URL or something like that. Those are the props that we are passing down into this component here. If you want to learn more about those, there's a link right here which goes down to match location and history right here. Those are the props that are passed down into this component here. So I'm going to go ahead and plug this in right now into our router right here. So just at the bottom right here, I'm going to add our last route. I'm going to prettify it a little bit. So we have route, path, my settings, render props. I should probably add a my settings, just a my settings link right there. Going to save that. Going to come back over to my page right here. Going to refresh. It already refreshed for me. And if I click on my settings, it's not going to do anything. And that is because if we come back over here, we see, hey, is the user authenticated? I haven't authenticated yet. I haven't signed in yet, which means that it is going to return a redirect back to sign in as soon as I click on that My Settings button. And we can see in the top bit right here, we actually have the sign in route, which is pretty good. the only problem is that we don't have a sign-in. We don't have a sign-in route handler just yet. So we need to do that. And we're going to make that sign-in route an unauthenticated route so that only unauthenticated users can actually access that sign-in page. If I come back over to my, these aren't the right slides. Let's do these ones. Here we go. Why is that? It's going to be a UTF-8 thing. I must have forgotten a UTF-8 tag somewhere, and the little Unicode arrows aren't rendering for some reason. But let's do an unauth route, which is essentially the exact same thing, just in reverse. If the user isn't authenticated, then go ahead and render the component. If they are authenticated, then render the redirect. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this real quick, pop that in here, make it all pretty real quick. I'll add one more link just so I can actually get to it. And sign in. Sign in. On a side note, the difference between sign in and login, that's tough. So we can see with our sign in route right here, if the user is authenticated, redirect them back to my settings. If they are not authenticated, then go ahead and render the sign in component. Coming back to my page here, gonna hit a refresh, I don't need to. Home, pricing, about, I'm not authenticated. I have it set up so that it de-authenticates every time the page is reloaded. If I click on my settings, nothing's going to happen. It's just going to redirect me back to the sign-in page. If I click the sign-in button, it's going to authenticate me, and now I'm going to go to the My Settings page. If I try to go back to that unauthenticated route, try and click on it, it's always going to redirect me back to My Settings, which is exactly what we want. Here we go. All right. Now, I could take this little bit of code right here, and I could copy and paste this for every single one of my authenticated and unauthenticated routes, and I don't really want to do that. I want to make some reusable components so that I can just say, oh, hey, this is an auth route, this is an unauth route, and fire this off all the time. So this is the part where we get to start using some composition. I want a bunch of auth and unauth routes. Auth routes are probably going to be things like my settings, my profile, a billing page would need to be authenticated. Unauth routes, create account, sign in, forgot password, reset password, all of these things, why are you even accessing them if you are already authenticated in the system? All the other stuff, I don't care about. /home, /pricing, /about, all that stuff doesn't matter to me if you are authenticated or not authenticated. I want something that's reusable and easy to read all over the place. I want something like a specific auth route component or an unauth route component. And of course, I still want to be able to use the built-in React Router route component for all the routes that I don't necessarily care about. So let's build an auth route component. This is going to be pretty similar to our other auth route component, except we didn't actually have a specific component for it. We just extended the render prop function on the route component in order to do the authentication for us. But now what we're going to do is we are literally going to create a new auth route component. And that auth route component is going to render another route. The route will do essentially the same thing that we were doing before, where it uses the route or the render prop, which is only called when the path actually matches. It's going to check and see if the user is authenticated or not. Then if the user is authenticated, it's going to render a component, but which component is it? And if it's not authenticated, redirect sign in. And this is where it gets a little bit more tricky, and we're going to use some ES6 dark magic to make this work. Composition, yay. This looks a lot worse than it is. Here's the way this works. We are using a functional stateless component inside of React. It's just a React component that does not have any state. This is our component's name is authRoute. You can see this is technically an arrow function. This is the body of the function. These are the arguments passed into the function. And this is the little arrow right here. We have some arguments at the top getting set using something called a destructuring assignment in combination with a spread operator. And then we can see, oh, hey, yeah, here's a route. This looks a little bit more familiar. It's got a render component. It's got that props component. We check and see if the user's authenticated. If it is, then we return a component with a capital C. And then if it's not, we return the redirect just like we had before. And then the end goal here is to have something that looks like that. Basically, we want it to look as close to a route as like a normal route that we would get from React Router as possible. Something with a path, something with a component, something with potentially, you know, exact or strict props that get passed to it if need be. This is where it gets a little bit more tricky. This top part here, this is destructuring assignment operator with the spread operator, says take all of the props that are passed to our auth route component and turn them into these two variables right here. The first variable is going to be component with a capital C. It's going to extract the props component from the auth route, it's going to extract the component prop from the auth route component and put that into component with a capital C. And then it is going to take all of the rest of the props and put them into a REST object. Then what it's going to do is it's going to take all of those other props, which include path and potentially exact or strict or any of those other modifiers on the actual route, and pass those down into the route prop. So what this route is going to look like eventually is this route will have a path prop passed to it from the auth route component, which is great. That's exactly what we want. Then we have to get into what do we actually render here. And that's where we get into this component thing. Component with a capital C is the component that is passed as a prop to the auth route right here. So if we wanted the settings component to only be something accessible by an authenticated user, I would say, all right, auth route, path, my settings, component settings. Inside of auth route, we're going to extract that component. We're going to take the rest, including the path right there. We're going to stick the rest into the route so that it's route, path, my settings. And then the route is going to render with the props, the match location and history props. It's going to figure out if the user's authenticated. And then it's going to take that settings component, because this component right here is technically this component passed in as the component prop. It gets a little wonky and complicated, but this actually works. And this will work for any kind of component that you throw at it. So I'm going to go ahead and I've already implemented the auth route in my actual page there, but I'm going to replace our previous auth route with our new auth route here and see that it works almost exactly the same. This is my previous auth route. I'm just going to go ahead and paste that in there, clean it up a little bit. I've already implemented auth route elsewhere. I'm going to save it, come back over to my page right here. Home, pricing, and about, all working as expected. If I go to my settings, I get redirected back to the sign in page. If I click sign in, I go to the my settings page. I can't go back to the sign in page because we still technically have an unauth route going here. I can sign out, and then if I keep on trying to click on my settings, so this auth route is actually working here. And I can reuse it for any other potential auth component that I want to have available. If I want to have my profile or billing or my inbox or something like that, all of that would work as well. And then, of course, we can't forget, wherever my slides are here, unauth route is essentially the exact same, just a little bit opposite. Instead of basically, if the user is authenticated, then go ahead and redirect them back to the unauthenticated component, probably like sign in or something like that. If the user is not authenticated, go ahead and render the component. Probably going to be something like sign in, create account, forgot password, reset password, all that kind of good stuff. Literally almost the exact same component as we had before. I didn't actually copy that. Hang on. So I'm going to get rid of the sign in one right here, clean that up. That wasn't right. Nope, I did the wrong thing. I want this. That's the actual route that we want to include inside of our router here. Excuse me. Here we are. Marvelous. Save. Is there? I got an extra curly brace in here. There we go. Save. Come on back over to here. I can see this is the sign-in page. My settings. I can't get in there because I'm not authed yet. Sign in through the sign-in page. I'm currently authed. I can't go back to the sign-in page because my unauthed route is detecting that I'm currently authenticated, and it's going to redirect me back to my settings and sign out. All that kind of stuff works just fine. Super. This is what our finished router looks like. On my actual code, it looks a little bit hairier just because of the beautify, but this is basically saying, here are all of the links right here. None of the links need to get modified for whether or not it is an authenticated or an unauthenticated route. And the auth route and the unauth route sit nicely within all of our other routes. So that way we can just have all of the routes in there, super clean, super easy to read, and it looks just like the other routes. So that works super nicely. Last couple things, exercises for the reader here. if you haven't played around too much with React Router, one of the things that I really, really love about it is the ability to do nested routes and sort of like nested views within that. So hypothetically, like if you had an inbox style of app that needed to have a whole bunch of different routes, you could have a, /inbox, /inbox, new, /inbox, /starred, snooze, /done, all that kind of stuff. It would still be fundamentally the same view, but you could render a couple of the subcomponents kind of differently. Totally love that about React Router. So definitely recommend checking that out, but that does get into nested routes pretty heavily, so it's a little bit tricky. Next thing is authorization. Is the user actually allowed to see invoice 1234 or something like that? You could do this at the component level, basically just check and see, hey, are they allowed to do that? And chances are your API should be enforcing this no matter what. But this might be something that could be done at the route level. I'm not totally sure. That might be a fun little project. This method that I've described to you here does not account for deep linking. That means that if I send somebody, /invoices, /1234, and they click on it, and they're like, oh, wait, hang on, not authenticated, redirect back to sign in, they sign in, then where do they go? They should be going back to invoices 1234, but maybe we didn't keep track of that correctly. So that'd be a fun little project, basically keeping track of the redirect URL inside of query parameters. And then public/marketing site, this isn't quite a React Router thing, but this is a thing that's very important to think about as a front-end web developer, is what are you serving every single time somebody comes to getstream.io versus getstream.io/app or app.getstream.io. Where does your web app sit and where does your marketing site sit? Those things are pretty critical to think about. So that might be another fun little thing that you can do. But I am out of time, so thank you guys so much. Appreciate it. And I don't know if I have time for questions, but I figure I can stick around afterwards if we want to just keep cranking here. Yeah, that's totally fine. Sweet.
Cool. Thank you so much.
Thank you.